In the last blogcast, I was talking about the fundamental rules of logic and how logic is simply a means of which to define an argument to make sure it's true and accurate within the construct and formulation of the argument. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about a slightly unrelated topic and how we know what we know on the ground level, because we were talking about the nature of tautologies and how they are self evident truths that are put together in the classical structure as a forms of proving themselves through themselves. And a lot of people can mistake that for circular logic, and I just wanted to talk about how we know what we know and talk a little bit more about the basal assumptions we make about reality. I use the word basal, which usually has denotations of primitive or original or uh, the origin in which many things derive from, as a kind of original pretense on which we can base the concept of what we know to be real about the world. So, what that really means in this context is that we have to make a list of ground line assumptions about how the world works in order to expand upon our knowledge of the world. Now, the first basal assumption that I'm going to put forward is that the world that we understand, the phenomenon that takes place within our experience, is actually real. That means that we are disregarding solipsism, which means that everything is a product of a brain in the jar type of mentality where my mind is the only mind that exists, and as a result, I'm only talking to myself, no matter, if I'm talking in this blogcast or if I'm going out on the street and talking with a random person, they're all just extensions of my brain's imagination. As by the very definition of its structure, it's an unfalsifiable argument. Because if we assume that everything is just a product of a single mind and that your reality is simply just a product of your brain, which is isolated and is creating the simulation, any baseline assumptions about reality, anything that we can assume to be real and accurate, is, by its very definition, subjective to the experience of that brain in the jar. Then nothing's true, except for the stuff that the brain in the jar perceives as true for the sake of its own indulgence. That would then leave us in a precarious situation, because how can we, outside of ourselves, confirm that anything is indeed true and accurate? And as a result, we then have to create a set of baseline assumptions. One, what we can perceive empirically, that is, through our senses and through our reasoning of said senses, is indeed an accurate and fairly real portrayal of what is happening. Well, as real as our imperfect senses can portray to our minds. Two, that the world that we are actually perceiving contains an outside qualia. That is, that the world has and will exist without the observer observing it. Which means the world has an outside identity outside of the bounds of my mind. Meaning that if I drop dead today, the world would continue on without me observing it. And three, that this outside observable phenomenon can be shared by others outside of my mind. Meaning that both myself and my friend can perceive the world, though we may internalize that differently. We are basically given the same amount of information. Now, how do we know that these assumptions are indeed true and accurate to the portrayal of reality? And the short answer is we don't. We are assuming these pretenses, hence the word assumption, because it's a much saner practice for us. As functional, hopefully rational human beings, we can agree upon the fact that if reality itself was subjective and not our internalization of said reality, that we would be living in some kind of plane of madness, which is of course assuming that we exist at all. Right, anyways, on the nature of tautology. Now, in the past blogcast, I said tautology, as defined by logic, is a formula or a structure in which each premise leading up to the conclusion can be perceived and can be concluded as true in every possible interpretation. And it seems like you can conclude that the tautology is the highest form that a logic statement can ascend to, in which it becomes an undisputed or ultimate form, kind of like when a logical statement gets a PhD. It is the ultimate authority on that particular statement and premise. And that's not true. So I wanted to clarify a little bit of that and to give you a better idea of what a tautology actually is. Now, I want to further define a tautology in that when I talked about it before, I mentioned that it was a series of statements, a premise leading to a conclusion that can be interpreted such that in every possible understanding of how that sentence is constructed and what it concludes, it is undeniably true. And what that also means is that the nature of a tautology is that it's unfalsifiable. Now, unfalsifiability does not necessarily denote that the argument itself is airtight and that insofar as the argument itself may not even be able to be proven or disproven. That the concept is so abstract that there's no actual means of which to determine whether or not the conclusion is indeed true or false in a practical sense. I.e., I can make a very strong logical argument that ends up being a tautology, such as we ultimately assume that the nature of the world is real and that our interactions are actually happening. And that can be formulated into a form of tautology. It's unfalsifiable by its nature because there's no way to determine outside of the experience whether or not things are actually happening. So as a result, we can neither confirm nor deny that reality actually exists. And if we are intellectually honest, we have to acknowledge that there is a potentiality that our means and understanding of reality can in fact actually not exist. So we have to be really careful when we use tautologies. Just because something is unfalsifiable doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful. In fact, more often times than not, we can look upon tautologies and find that they're indeed useless in practical application. So one of the ways in which we determine whether or not a tautology is useful is does this actually make sense? By accepting this tautology, does this open itself for further interpretation and allows me to have further analysis upon the other outside statements that seem to support this type of understanding, if there is that type of understanding. So, as a summary, basically, tautologies are not the ultimate form of truth statement. They are not the hard-lined rules that we base our understanding of reality on. They are merely unfalsifiable, and it may lead itself to being useful or useless, depending on the statements that the tautology raises itself up to. Circular reasoning, on the other hand, attempts to solidify a statement or a conclusion based on an assumption that was made that leads back to the conclusion, such as, I believe the contents of this book because the book says in itself it's true. The problem about this type of reasoning is, hopefully it should be very obvious, is that outside of the book there's no means to determine whether or not there's any logic in the statement. So as a result, it tries to support itself through itself, which in itself is a logical fallacy. So that's pretty much what I wanted to touch upon in this particular episode of the Blogcast. I just wanted to clarify that and to make us all on the same page.